Okay, for my next review, we're going to talk about a video put together by Stated Clearly. I'm going to play it while we go and just talk while the animation moves. Stated Clearly, as well as Crash Courses and Amoeba Sisters, are some of the best sources on the internet for animated tutorials. And this one happens to be, of course, on natural selection and how that leads to evolution. One of the things I like about this is it also brings in some, in terms of next generation science standards, brings in some scientific practices and talks about scientific thinking. Here it starts talking about descent with modification as well as common descent. So here in the discussion of descent with modification, they point out that it's a fact that we see that organisms look like their parents but have some variation. He goes on from this, and I'll jump ahead just a little bit, to talk about the idea of common descent and how this isn't an observable fact, but it's a conclusion based on a series of evidence that we have. And I like the conversation going on about scientific language like facts and conclusions and hypotheses and evidence, and all that stuff is highlighted really well in here. So here he says this is a conclusion based on some of our data, and then he goes through and highlights some of the data, how it's fossils and DNA and homologous structures and so on. But what I want to do is jump ahead a little bit more where he starts describing natural selection, because he talks at first about how this idea was rejected of common descent because we couldn't get order and complexity from random chaos. And I always like it when scientists or when authors talk about the flaws with their arguments, which I think is a good thing that he does here. But as he moves on, he goes on and explains how natural selection provides that order. I'll give him a little bit of time to talk here. He talks about Darwin and just get an idea of how the video flows.
Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, was a naturalist, someone who studies nature. At the start of his career, he traveled the world by ship, collecting and documenting plants and animals. During his travels, Darwin became very interested in the idea of common descent. He noticed that islands contain species of plants and animals unique to those islands. They can't be found anyplace else on Earth, but they often look and behave surprisingly similar to creatures found on nearby continents. Tortoises on the Galapagos.
I think this is really good. The animation does a good job of guiding the audience in the direction. He's explaining here how Galapagos tortoises are much more like tortoises in South America than they are ones in Africa, and talks about how this might be evidence of common descent. He talks about how perhaps some of the first organisms got to the Galapagos by floating over on rafts and then laying their eggs and then specializing for those environments. And so here you see this eventual evolution into specialized organisms for different environments. They do a great job, and as you keep going through, he talks about how some of the islands in the Galapagos have a lot of vegetation, and so they have relatively large domes for their shells, and they also are very large, whereas ones on islands that are mostly cacti have a different shape so that they can reach up and grab their food. So from this discussion about specialization in these different environments, he starts talking about how the organisms might have gotten there, and he introduces us to some breeders. And so we move on to this next little bit here, and I'll let it play for a bit because I think it's good.
How did this sculpting take place? Random descent with modification alone could never do such a thing. Darwin drew upon his knowledge of selective breeding to answer this question. For thousands of years, farmers have been taking wild plants and animals, and through the process of selective breeding, have sculpted the original wild forms into new domestic forms, much better suited for human use and consumption. The process is slow but simple. If a single plant produces...
This is brilliant. I think this is great right here.
Most will grow to be nearly identical to the parent plant. A few, however, will be slightly different. Some variations will be undesirable, smaller size, bitter taste, vulnerability to disease, and so on. Other variations will be highly valued. Thicker, sweeter leaves, for example. If a farmer only allows the best plants to reproduce and create seeds for the next crop, small positive changes will add up over multiple generations, eventually producing a dramatically superior vegetable. You might be surprised to hear that broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are all just different breeds of a single type of weed commonly found along the shores of the English Channel.
Again, I find this very, very convincing and very, very well put together. The animation really is set up by the audio, and the audio feeds into it. It does a really good job of explaining selection and how farmers do that. And then he does a really nice pivot and starts talking about how natural selection does the same thing, but in a natural environment. He talks about how the natural world is really harsh, how there are lots of things out there trying to kill you, like the sun and the cold and bacteria, and that in a natural environment you might get somewhat the same effect. So here you have the chameleon, a very traditional idea, going away and eating those that it can see and sparing those it can't, thus driving evolution. So this goes on, and he continues to describe stuff. I think that the entirety of the video has the same kind of quality, and I very much like it. These are some of the best tools, I think, that we can start using more regularly for talking to our students about some of these levels of content. As far as my class goes right now, I'm actually teaching about natural selection, and this is the kind of video I would love to have my kids actually see. When I'm doing this distance learning curriculum, it's very, very hard to deliver content in a way that's this dynamic. But this kind of a tutorial, I think, does a great job. And he comes back and talks about it at the end, too. So good stuff. This whole series is good. Like I said, along with Crash Course and Amoeba Sisters, I think it's right where we should be.